Okay, hello guys. This is Mr. Cannon, and today we're going to be looking at the causes of the Civil War and the Civil War. And of course, the Civil War is referring to the war between the North and the South, or the Union and the Confederacy. And we're going to be looking at why this war occurred and what are some of the things you need to know about the war. So we're going to start with some of the compromises that occurred leading up to the war. Now, I've heard people say before that the war could not have been avoided, and that it was naturally going to happen. Well, I don't know if that's true, but I've heard other people say that the politicians of the day did nothing to stop the Civil War from happening. I don't think that's true either. And if we look at the compromises here, there were attempts. Now, they may have been poor attempts, but there were attempts to compromise on the issue of slavery. And of course, slavery is going to be one of the overall causes of the war. It's going to be a major factor in what caused the Civil War. And if we go all the way back to the Missouri Compromise, what we had prior to this was a balance of power between the slave and the free states in America. So you had in the Senate, you had an equal number of slave state votes and free state votes. Well, what's going to happen with Missouri is when Missouri applies for statehood, they are a slave state. And so the free states, the free areas, the northern areas are going to protest and say, now, wait a minute, if we allow Missouri to become a slave state, that means the areas in the South will have more power than the free areas of America have. And so they proposed adding another state to the north, and that state was going to become Maine. Maine had previously been known as Massachusetts. Massachusetts was divided into two different areas. Today it is not, because they took that top area of Massachusetts and made it a separate state called Maine, which meant that Maine was going to get 2 senators, Missouri was going to get 2 senators, and the balance of power would stay equal between the slave and the free states. And so we thought that that would, or they thought, excuse me, that that would sort of solve the problem. And what they also did is they said that any new area that comes into America, uh, if it's north of this 3630 line, which is the southern border of Missouri, you can see it there on the map, at the top map. You can see it's a line that they said is going to separate any new area north of that line would be free, and any new area south of that line would be slave. And that way there wouldn't be any question about these new territories coming into America, whether they would be free or slave. If they were north of the line, they would be free. If they were south of the line, they would be slave. And for 30 years, that system sort of worked. But the problem was, after the Mexican War, when we gained large amounts of territory out in the southwest of the United States, one of those areas in the southwest, or in the west, called California, is going to be ready almost immediately to become a state. And so in that middle map, you can see the Compromise of 1850. If we drew a line at that 3630 parallel, which is the southern border of Missouri, and ran it all the way across the country, it would cut California in two. And California wasn't going to be cut in two. And so we've got a problem. Now that area is going to have to be either slave or free, since it can't be cut in half. And that's where we have a new set of arguments develop in America, in the Senate especially, whether that area is going to be slave or free. And so what the Compromise of 1850 did is it said to the South, the North did, the North said, we are going to get California as a free state. In return, we will give you a fugitive slave law. One of the things that was happening in this period in 1850 was you had a number of slaves who were running away and escaping into the North, and some of them eventually into Canada, under the process called the Underground Railroad, which was a secret set of houses called stations where slaves could eventually make their way from the South to the North. Now, that was very dangerous to do because you could be caught, and if you were caught, the punishment was severe. But you did have some of these slaves actually make it to the North, and some of them made it into Canada where they could not be touched. And so Southern plantation owners were desperate to get a new fugitive slave law that would require Northern whites to help capture those runaway slaves in northern areas. And so that's what the Compromise of 1850 did. California is going to become a free state, which is going to give the North more power, but the South is going to get a fugitive slave law, a strict fugitive slave law, which requires Northerners to help return runaway slaves. Now, it didn't work out that way, and in fact, neither side was very happy with the compromise. So what the Compromise of 1850 actually does is it makes more tension in America. It makes the situation even worse. Both sides begin to distrust each other even more. Okay, and now we go a few years later, and we have two new territories who are ready to enter the Union. These were territories that were part of the Louisiana Purchase, and they're finally ready to become territories, and we called them Kansas and Nebraska. Now the problem is, again, the Missouri Compromise line has been basically thrown out, and so the question is, how are we going to decide the question of slavery in Kansas and Nebraska? And the issue was so tense in the Congress that what they decided to do was allow Kansas and Nebraska to decide the question for themselves in a vote. That's called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is allowing the people to vote on the issue for themselves. And in this case, the issue was slavery. Well, the problem was that once that happened, you had radical pro-slavery people from the South and radical anti-slavery people from the North rush into the Kansas territory, and they began fighting one another. And it got so bad, it was a bloodbath, and Kansas actually became known as Bleeding or Bloody Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas was sort of a prelude to the Civil War. It's actually going to show us how nasty this can get. And so Kansas was so bad, some people called it a killing field. They said that there was just anarchy there. There was no order, no law and order. And it was ugly. It was pretty ugly there. And so that's going to show us how violent this could actually get. Okay, let's talk about abolitionists. All right, so abolitionists are people who wanted to end slavery in America. They wanted to abolish or completely end slavery. Abolitionists did not make up a majority of the population. In fact, most people in America didn't really care strongly one way or another about slavery. You had a majority of Southerners, white Southerners, did not own slaves. Now, they weren't trying to end slavery, but they didn't own slaves, and the truth is they probably never would own slaves, and they understood that because to be a slave owner, you had to be wealthy. And so slavery really didn't affect them on a personal level one way or another. And in the North, the truth is the majority of white Northerners didn't really care about slavery either. But you did have a group that began to grow more and more, even though they were a minority, and they were people who wanted to end slavery. One of those people who wanted to end slavery, her name was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was actually a white lady from Connecticut, but she had traveled to Missouri and saw slavery firsthand. And so she wrote a book. It's one of the most well-known books in American history. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what Uncle Tom's Cabin was, it was a fictional account of life on a plantation. And as you can imagine, she wanted to portray it in the harshest terms. So when she wrote her book, she wasn't writing necessarily a historical account that was meant to be accurate for every plantation everywhere in America. But what she wanted to do was she wanted to convince people that there were areas in the South where this kind of abuse was going on, and she wanted to turn people against slavery. She had a motive for writing the book. And it did. Uncle Tom's Cabin turned a lot of the, not a lot, but it turned some of those Northerners who really didn't care one way or another about slavery, more of them are going to become abolitionists as a result. Now, it's still a minority of the North, but you did have more and more of them, and they were very vocal. They began to write and speak out against slavery in a major way. In fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe is so important that after the Civil War started, Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, and he said to her, "So you're the little lady who caused this great war." Now, I don't think Harriet Beecher Stowe caused the Civil War, but that he was expressing how important her book actually was. Okay, another issue we're going to see that's going to divide the North and South even more is going to be a Supreme Court decision called the Dred Scott decision. Now, the Dred Scott decision is infamous. It's a bad decision. People look back at that decision today and say, the Supreme Court, what were you thinking? That was just a terrible decision. What it was Dred Scott, who you can see in the picture there on the right. Dred Scott was a slave who had actually traveled to free areas with his owner. His owner was a surgeon, an army surgeon, so he had actually traveled to areas like Illinois. And Illinois was a free state. Missouri, where he was originally from, is a slave state, but Illinois was a free state. And so when Dred Scott's owner died, Dred Scott was willed to the owner's children. But Dred Scott's view was that he had lived in a free state, and so therefore he should be free. So he and his team of lawyers sued for his freedom, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. What the Supreme Court ruled didn't just have to do with Dred Scott, but they ruled about slavery everywhere in America. And they really did two things. Number one, they said that slaves weren't citizens and therefore could not sue. They basically said that this lawsuit was null and void, that slaves were property. They were not considered citizens of America. The second thing that they said was that slavery could not be banned in any of the territories by Congress. Only a state could ban slavery. So what they're basically saying is that slavery is a states' rights issue, that only states can control that issue. So anywhere where there's not a state, you see it out there in the red or the orange, all those territories, they are controlled by the Congress. They're controlled by the federal government. And what the Dred Scott ruling said is that Congress could not ban slavery in any of those areas. Well, that's going to cause huge division in America. Southerners, Southern plantation owners, are going to celebrate the decision and say this was a win for states' rights. Northern abolitionists especially are going to look at that decision and they're going to say this is an awful decision, it's a terrible precedent, and they're going to start demanding more and more radical measures. Some of them are, at least. One of those radical abolitionists was a white man named John Brown. John Brown, you can see his picture there, that he was younger in that picture. But John Brown is a radical abolitionist. What separated John Brown from most abolitionists was that he believed violence was the only answer to ending slavery. And so he's going to attempt to create a slave rebellion in America. All right. Now, he's already pretty known for killing 5 people. He and his followers killed 5 people in Kansas. Remember I told you we had a bloodshed in Kansas, bleeding Kansas? Well, he and his followers were out there and they got into a fight with some pro-slavery people and ended up killing 5 people in what was known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. Well, after that event happened, John Brown headed back east to Virginia, and he believed he had a message from God which said that the only way to end slavery was through violence. So he and his followers actually break into a federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Now, an arsenal is an area that has military equipment. Okay, so back then we're talking about guns and ammunition and cannons. And so they break in, I don't know how they did it, but they actually broke into this federal arsenal, and they were going to get all these weapons and take them into the countryside and arm slaves. Now, before they could ever get out of the arsenal, they were surrounded by the Marines and they were caught. Actually, Robert E. Lee, who's going to be an important person in the Civil War, is going to be the Union colonel who leads the effort to catch John Brown. And John Brown and his followers are going to be hanged for treason. Now, the reason this is so important is because in the South, people slave owners especially become very fearful that John Brown is not a lone wolf, so to speak, that there are lots of John Browns out there. Now, there weren't, but Southerners began to fear that they were. And even Southerners who didn't own slavery were very fearful of people like John Brown. They said, see, look at what those radical abolitionists are promoting. They're promoting murder. They want to see innocent people murdered. And if you did have a slave rebellion, that was certainly a possibility that people who didn't own slaves could be killed in the process. So that in the South, they were very fearful that there were a lot of John Browns out there. In the North, there were some who actually made John Brown into a martyr and made him into a hero. And that's going to divide the country even more. So John Brown's raid is going to be a cause of the Civil War, no doubt about it. Okay? And then the final cause we want to look at is the election of 1860. We've never had an election in our history like the election of 1860. We've had some pretty weird elections, okay? We've had elections that actually had to go to the House of Representatives, and our president was actually voted on in the House of Representatives, not by the people. Our last election was pretty weird because the person who won the election, Donald Trump, did not win the popular vote. And that's only happened 4 times in our history where a person has won the presidency through the Electoral College but has lost a popular vote. Well, this election in 1860 is even weirder than that. And the reason it's so weird is because you didn't have 2 major candidates like we normally do, the Republican and the Democrat. You didn't have that. You actually had 4 big candidates running for the presidency, and all 4 of them split the vote. And so in the end, Abraham Lincoln, who led a brand new party called the Republican Party, which was an anti-slavery party, Abraham Lincoln is going to win the presidency by winning 39.4% of the vote. Now let's think about that for a second. If 39.4% of the people voted for Lincoln, that means that 60% of the people voted for somebody else. Can you imagine that? 60% of the people voted for somebody else. But because Lincoln got enough votes in the North and the vote was split 4 ways, he's able to win a majority of the Electoral College. And so he doesn't win a single vote in the South, but Lincoln becomes the president. And when he becomes the president, South Carolina freaks out. They are terrified that Lincoln is going to ban slavery. Now, Lincoln himself has made it very clear that his goal is not to ban slavery, that his goal is to see slavery diminished. He wants to keep it from spreading into the territories. He disagreed with the Dred Scott decision, but he made it very clear that his goal was not to ban slavery. And yet South Carolina, the leaders of South Carolina, who were slave owners because they were the wealthy members of society, they were terrified and called for a secession convention. And that's what we're going to look at next. Secession is the idea that a state can leave or secede from the Union if they want to. Now, this had been an issue from the very beginning of our history, where you had this idea of what was called states' rights. Who's going to have more power? Is it going to be the state governments or the federal government? And if we go all the way back to Jefferson versus Hamilton, that was an issue between those 2 men and those 2 parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. Well, that issue never really goes away. And in fact, during the War of 1812, New England, some of the New England states threatened to secede because they didn't want to go to war with England during the War of 1812. So you can actually see that this is not a new idea that South Carolina came up with. Secession was something that had been discussed for decades. And certainly slavery is going to be the issue that sparks South Carolina to secede. South Carolina's view is that the state has a right to secede if they want to. And South Carolina does just that. When they secede, other southern states over the next few months are going to join them. Now, not all the southern states who end up in the Confederacy are going to join at the same time. Some of them are going to wait. And what ends up happening is when Lincoln begins raising an army to stop South Carolina from seceding, that's when some of the last southern states vote to secede as well. And the reason they do, like a state like Virginia, for instance, Virginia didn't have nearly as much slavery as South Carolina did. Virginia did not want to secede from the Union, but Virginia's view was that they could not allow their brother, so to speak, to be attacked by the federal government. And so when they saw that that was going to happen, places, I think it was Virginia and a couple other states, seceded. Now, there were 4 states that had slavery, but they did not secede from the Union. They're called border states. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were the border states. And then eventually West Virginia is going to break off from Virginia, and they're going to have slavery, but they're going to stay in the Union as well. Okay, so the election of Lincoln terrifies South Carolina. South Carolina votes to secede in December 1860. And at that point, war is inevitable because both sides can't come to an agreement. South Carolina says they have the right to secede. The federal government under Abraham Lincoln says absolutely not. You do not have the right to secede. So the ultimate cause, yes, slavery is a huge issue that's going to cause South Carolina to secede, but the ultimate issue that causes the war is going to be South Carolina seceding from the Union. Okay. Let's talk about advantages and disadvantages that each side has in the war. Now, in reality, the North had the vast majority of advantages. The North had an advantage in the number of people. They could have a much bigger army simply because they had more people. And when it came to fighting men, if you took out slaves as fighters, which the South did, early in the war, the South had no desire to allow slaves to be armed. They would not hear it. And so because of that, if you just look at white fighting men, the North had four times as many fighting men as the South did. Railroad miles. The North's going to have way more railroads, which is going to allow them to move goods and supplies to and from places. Industry. Look at those manufacturing plants. The North had 86% of the factories in America, which means they can produce anything they need to produce. Weapons, guns, clothes, whatever it might be that they need to fight a war, they can produce it. But the South cannot. The South, because they have so few factories, has to rely on outside help to have this war. And that outside help is going to come from Britain and France. What we're going to find is that it's going to be hard for Britain and France to get that help into the South. And then, of course, industrial workers. You can see 92% of all the workers were in the North. Most Southerners were farmers. Small farmers, but they were farmers. All right, because of the advantages that the North had, the North is going to come up with a strategy called the Anaconda Plan. It's actually promoted by a Union general called Winfield Scott. And what Scott it's going to be called Scott's Great Snake, or the Anaconda Plan. And what the Anaconda Plan was designed to do was to set up a blockade along the ports of the South. So it was designed to send ships along the ports of the South and along the Mississippi River and squeeze the life out of the South, because the South couldn't produce the stuff that they needed to fight the war. If you can keep those goods from coming into the South and to the armies, then eventually those armies will have to surrender and give up because they won't have the stuff that they need to fight the war. And it was a very effective plan called the Anaconda Plan. There are actually 3 parts to it. The first part is blockading the coastline. The second part is blockading the Mississippi River, which is going to require the North to win battles along the Mississippi River. And then the third part of the plan was, for the Union plan, was to actually capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. Only 60 miles separated the 2 capitals, Richmond and Washington, D.C. That's why you're going to see so many of the Civil War battles occurring in Virginia. What we're going to find is that even though the blockade is going to work great for the North, and even though taking the Mississippi River is going to work great for the North, that taking that capital of Richmond is going to be the biggest obstacle to the Union Army. And in fact, many of the Southern victories are going to be right there in Virginia, fighting off the Union advance. Okay. So the South real big advantages. They didn't have many, but their real big advantage was they had two. Number one, they are playing defense. All right, so the fight is going to happen primarily on Southern soil. So they know the ground, they know where to move armies. They just are good at that, and so that's going to be an advantage. And it's always harder to attack than it is to be attacked. And the second advantage is going to be in the area of generals. Whereas the Union had much better political leadership with Abraham Lincoln, the South had the better military leadership, at least early in the war, with men like Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. Stonewall Jackson is a very interesting figure. He's a guy who was very religious. He was a Calvinist, which means he believed that everything that happened to him was God's will. So he believed that no matter what he did in a battle, it didn't matter because God had assigned his date of death. So he could do whatever he wanted to, and if it wasn't his time to die, he wouldn't die, which makes him a very, very dangerous person on the battlefield because it means he is completely courageous. He's not scared of anything. But Stonewall Jackson is going to make a name for himself at the first major battle of the war, called the Battle of Bull Run or Manassas. Now, the first shots of the Civil War are actually going to occur here in South Carolina, off of our coast at a place called Fort Sumter. Some of you may have even visited Fort Sumter. But Fort Sumter was a Union fort. Most of the Union forts in the South had been given up voluntarily, and the Union had withdrawn from them. But Lincoln instead resupplied Fort Sumter. He wanted South Carolina to fire on Fort Sumter so that he could say, you started it. Sort of the old thing, you hit me first. You've heard that before when maybe you're fighting with a sibling. You hit me first. Well, Lincoln wanted to be able to say that the South hit them first. And that's what happened. Citadel cadets actually are the ones who are going to fire on Fort Sumter, and it's going to be the first shots of the Civil War. Other than that, Fort Sumter is not really that important. It's only important because it was the first shots. The first big battle of importance is going to be in Virginia, and it's called Manassas or Bull Run. The Union called battles by the local body of water, and Bull Run was the local body of water. The Confederacy called it by the local town. Manassas was the closest town to the battle. And actually at this first battle, you had people from Washington, D.C., people come and set up picnics to watch this first giant battle. Now, obviously, after about 15 minutes, those same people are going to be running back home, screaming because they have seen things that you and I hopefully will never see. Just absolute carnage and bloodshed. I don't know why these people thought that setting up picnics would be a good idea, but they did. And so they're going to run away. Well, they're not the only ones who are going to run. The Union Army is actually going to run in disarray as well. The Battle of Manassas, the first battle, is going to be a huge victory for the Confederacy. And Stonewall Jackson is actually going to get his nickname at this battle because as Union forces are pushing against the Confederacy and it looks like the Confederates are about to break, some of his men say, look at General Jackson sitting up like a stone wall because he's trying to rally his men to fight back. And that's exactly what happens. And the Confederates push back, and before you know it, they break through the Union lines. The Union end up running in disarray and actually leaving Washington, D.C. wide open. Fortunately for the Union, the Confederates weren't organized enough either to be able to take advantage of that. Okay. All right, this is another man that was very important to the Civil War. This is a man named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee eventually is going to be given command of the entire Confederate Army. And as general of the Confederate Army, he is going to be very, very difficult to defeat. Robert E. Lee took a lot of chances, and he won a lot of early battles because of that. And in fact, it frustrated Lincoln so much that he continually fired his generals because they could not defeat Robert E. Lee. And so the first couple years of the war, even though the war wasn't going so well for the Confederacy in the West, it was going very well for the Confederacy in Virginia, as Robert E. Lee won battle after battle after battle. Now, what is going to eventually change that is going to be some big turning points. One of those turning points is going to be the Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam was in Maryland. Actually, after a little while, Lee came up with the idea to invade the North. Lee's view was that if he continued to fight a defensive war, that eventually he would run out of supplies. And so his view was he had to take the war to the north and defeat the Northern Army of the Potomac in the North so it would force Lincoln to end the war. I actually think Lee was right about that, but we still debate that today, whether that's true or not. In any event, the Battle of Antietam is going to be a place where Lee's army is stopped. Now, one of the interesting parts of this war is that the Union soldiers who are following Lee's army in Maryland, one of them is going to find a copy of Lee's plans on the ground. A Confederate soldier had actually dropped these plans out of his pocket by accident. They were wrapped around 3 cigars. Tobacco was one of the few things that Northern troops had a hard time getting their hands on. And so when this Union soldier sees these cigars, he immediately picks them up. What he didn't realize is that wrapped around those cigars were the Confederate battle plans. So he takes it to his superior officer, and before you know it, the Union Army understands Lee's exact plan. And so they end up attacking him at the Battle of Antietam. It is the bloodiest one day in American history. 26,000 people, casualties, killed, wounded, or missing on that one day. It was just a very, very bad battle. In the end, Lee is able to escape back into Virginia, but he's stopped. And this is one of the first times that the Union can really claim a major victory in the war, at least in the East, in the eastern part of the war. And as a result, Lincoln's going to declare victory. He is going to issue what's called the Emancipation Proclamation. He had been waiting on this opportunity. And what the Emancipation Proclamation did was free the slaves in the Confederate States. It did not free slaves everywhere, only in the Confederate States, in the states that are in rebellion. What was the point of the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, a couple of things. It was designed to free some of the slaves, yes. But one of the major goals of the Emancipation Proclamation was to make this a war about slavery so that England and France would stay out of the war. England and France had been sort of flirting with the Confederacy, flirting with the idea that they would join with the Confederacy to fight the United States. But England and France had banned slavery at this point in their histories. And so if Lincoln could make this a war about slavery, then it would be very difficult for England and France to enter the war because their people would not have that. And so the Emancipation Proclamation, though it does free some of the slaves, it does not free all of them. And it is an important document in keeping the European countries out of the war. Okay? Another turning point is going to happen at a place called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. After Lee builds his army back up in June 1863, he actually heads north again. This time he's going to try a very similar tactic where he's going to try to draw the Union Army out into the open where it can be destroyed. At this point in the war, Stonewall Jackson is dead. He had been killed shot by his own men. He lost his left arm, and then eventually in a hospital, he developed pneumonia and died. And so Lee is going to go up into Pennsylvania without his most trusted offensive general. And eventually the Union are going to defeat the Confederates at Gettysburg. It's very interesting if you get a chance to research that battle. It's a very interesting battle. The bottom line of the battle is that it occurred over 3 days. It's the bloodiest battle in American history, whereas Antietam's the bloodiest one day. Gettysburg is the bloodiest battle. 53,000 combined casualties. Lee's army is defeated and pushed out of the North. Now, the war is not over, but at that point, Lee's army will never again be strong enough to invade the North. And Lee's fear is going to come true. His fear was that eventually his army would just be run down. They would lose so many men and so many supplies, they couldn't keep up with Northern population and Northern industry. And over the next 2 years, that's what's going to happen. And then the last turning point I want to talk about is the Battle of Vicksburg. A day after the Confederates are defeated at Gettysburg, General Ulysses S. Grant is going to take Vicksburg, Mississippi after a month-long siege. and that victory is going to allow the Union to control the entire Mississippi River for the remainder of the war, basically cutting the Confederacy in two. Vicksburg actually is very interesting because in that siege, the Confederate army who are in this town and surrounded and can't escape, it's going to be so bad for the people in Vicksburg and the army in Vicksburg, they're going to rely on eating rats and horses and dogs. And when the rats and horses and dogs are gone, they resort to eating the corn out of animal dung. That is so gross, isn't it? But that's what they resorted to trying to survive. But eventually, as people starved to death, there are actually tales of cannibalism, eating other people. But after a while, they had to surrender. And when they surrendered, when those Confederate troops and the citizens came out of Vicksburg, they looked awful. It looked like a picture you'd see in a concentration camp after World War II. Just terrible. Okay, we'll come to our last topic for this lesson, and that is about William Tecumseh Sherman and his total war in the South. So while Grant has been moved to the east to take on Lee's army towards the end of the war, he's left in charge of the West William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman is going to use what's called his march to the sea to try to bring the South to its knees. And in his march to the sea, he goes from Tennessee into Georgia, through Atlanta, where he burns Atlanta, and then on his way to Savannah, which is why it's called his march to the sea. And then he makes his way back up from Savannah into South Carolina in a V pattern, and then eventually up into North Carolina. And of course, when he's in South Carolina, he's going to destroy and burn the city of Columbia. And you can see there that photograph is taken from the grounds of the State House, looking down, I guess that's Main Street in Columbia, and you can see the damage done by Sherman and his men. Sherman's view of war was called total war, and total war means he targeted civilians as well as the military. Now, when I say targeted civilians, in biblical times, total war meant that you would even kill women and children. Sherman didn't do that. Sherman, when I say he targeted civilians, I mean he targeted their assets. He targeted their properties. So he did burn farms and destroy homes, and that was not something that typically the military did, but in Sherman's case, he did it because he's trying to bring the Deep South to its knees to end the war, and it was very successful. What's going to happen is, as these areas are devastated by Sherman's march, his 160,000 troops basically cut a 60-mile swath across these areas, destroying everything in their path, or as much as they can in their path. And the end result is you see the South really begin to crumble, and Lee's army in Virginia becomes smaller as people began getting letters from home saying, hey, you got to come home. Our farm's been destroyed. We need you at home. And those men begin to desert Lee's army, and his army gets smaller and smaller, which is going to make it easier for Grant to defeat him at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where the final surrender of Lee's army takes place. It's not the complete end of the Civil War, but it is the beginning of the end for the South once Lee's army surrenders, and Sherman's going to play a role in that, in bringing the Deep South areas like Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, bring them to their knees as people begin to suffer. Sherman is a bad name in the South for 100 years after this event happened. I remember even my grandmother, Sherman was a bad name to her. You didn't say that name. That was still considered, and she was 2 generations removed from the Civil War, but it was still considered a bad word because people held such a grudge against him for what he did. Sherman wasn't a bad man, but he certainly employed what we would call hard warfare. And so that's the story of the Civil War. If you have any questions as you go through the lesson, trying to answer these questions, feel free to ask Ms. Lekovich if you have her, or me, Mr. Cannon, if you have me, and we will be glad to help you.